Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Hello, welcome to another show of the Transatlantic Pararadio show. Tonight I am joined by a different host again. Unfortunately, my old friend Ron is still a bit tied up with his various conferences around America. So I have a good friend of mine who's come along tonight to act as a kind of guest come co-host. We're going to talk a little bit about a subject that we're both interested in a bit later on. But the first part of the show, I really want to talk to my friend and get her to tell a bit more about herself. So, yes. Kerry Greenaway, my guest for this evening, and co-host as well. So as a co-host, I think you should probably tell us a little bit about yourself, Kerry. So over to you. Tell me, who are you?
Well, I am Kerry Greenaway, and I run my own company that sells crystals and minerals, and the company is called Spirit and Soul Island. And I work very closely with crystals and minerals in lots of different ways. The only way I don't work with them is in healing. I never felt a calling to go down the healing route, but I work in a lot of other ways with them, a lot to do with self-empowerment. So that's what I do. I'm also a radio presenter on other stations, 2 other stations, and I am a paranormal investigator as well. So I do quite a lot of stuff.
Excellent, absolutely. Sounds like you keep yourself very busy in this weird world of the paranormal. I'm really interested.
Yeah, I do.
Well, that's good because it is a weird world. It's nice to be involved in weird world stuff, especially when the ordinary world can get a bit nasty and unpleasant. But we won't get down that road tonight. So crystals, I have some knowledge of them. I did do geology many moons ago at college. In fact, I found geology itself was quite interesting. The first year of the A-level I was doing was a fantastic teacher called Mr. Clark, who made it very lively and interesting, and we really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, he left, and the beginning of the second year, we had a new teacher called Mr. Roebuck. Now, Roebuck has got an interesting name, because it has a connection to the next part of the show, but I'll talk about that later on. But Mr. Roebuck was quite possibly the most boring person I have ever heard talk as a teacher. And it was, funny enough, the subject was crystallography, which is how the crystals form, which you think would be absolutely fascinating. How someone can make a subject as interesting as that, as boring as he did, is just beyond belief. With a classroom of 8 of us, I managed to fall asleep because it was so boring. It really was, unfortunately. So, almost crystals in a funny way, are kind of a gap in my knowledge of geology because I just fell asleep listening to talk about crystal formation. So, how did you get into the use of crystals in the first place?
Well, it was quite a strange little story, really. I mean, I've always had an interest and been drawn to crystals, and always had like a small collection, as most people do, along the way. You know, when you go out, you go to a little shop and pick a piece up here and there. Mm-hmm. And it was only really when I hit a time in my life, and I was just so bored with life, and I needed a new direction, and I just couldn't see a way forward at all. And I went and had a tarot reading, funnily enough, and what came out of that tarot reading is your way forward will come out from a young boy. And I have 2 young sons. And I was like, well, okay, fair enough. We'll see. Anyway, one night, we'd been to the Natural History Museum. I'd taken them there and lived in the crystal and mineral section with them. And, they were really engaged and really interested. But my eldest son never sleeps. He's one of these children that just doesn't sleep. Mm-hmm. So anyway, he was downstairs with me, and there was nothing on the TV at all to watch that was suitable for his age, because it was quite late, and I was like, oh, what do I do? So I said, let's have a look on the computer, and we were looking at minerals and crystals because we've been at the Natural History Museum throughout the day, and when I put the search in, the first thing that came up was a wholesaler. Yeah. And he went, and Ryder, that's my son, turned around and went, let's have a look. And I went, oh, okay. And literally, I saw it and I thought, that's interesting. Prices were okay. The minimum order was okay. And I was thinking, okay, well, that's interesting, and forgot, to be fair, didn't really give it any more thought. Anyway, 2 or 3 days later, I went round to a friend's house, and she had actually been out and bought some angel cards, and we was playing around, as you do, with these cards, and she'd bought a pendulum. That really was where it started. She did a 3-card oracle read from the book. It was from the book. It wasn't anything, particularly intuitively done. And the first card that came out was crystals.
Wow.
The second card that came out was way forward. And the third card that came out was go for it. And I sat there. Now, I hadn't told her about this Google search or what had come out in the tarot reading. It was complete. We hadn't even got onto that subject. Mm-hmm. And I just sat back in my chair and I just looked at her and I just started to laugh. And she was like, why are you laughing? And then I told her everything that had happened. And she went, well, if that's not a sign, I don't know what is. Mm-hmm. And then I'm a single mum, so money's always an issue. Mm. And I was like, right, okay, so if I'm going to do this, I need to find the minimum order value. And, the next day I got a cheque through the post, which was like a refund from the electricity board at the time. They were doing like refunds for overcharging. Something was going on along those lines. Perfect. And it was for the right amount for a minimum order.
Perfect.
And like I say, if that wasn't a sign, I don't know what was. Indeed. And literally, I cashed the cheque, put an order in, and haven't looked back since.
Excellent.
So that's how I started, really, in the business.
Yeah. And how long ago was that? How long have you been going?
I've been going 4 years now.
Excellent.
It's going really well. And when I first started, it was very... I didn't know a lot. I mean, the spiritual side, I'd read tarot cards for a long time, mm-hmm. and I dabbled a bit. I'd been to circles and I'd been to clairvoyant nights and stuff like that, but I hadn't worked, as it were, in the field. I'd just sort of like been a bystander. I wasn't even paranormal investigating at this time, so I really was right at the very beginning of my journey. And so when I first started, it was literally I bought 2 or 3 lots of tumble stones. I bought an array of different bits and bobs and literally started learning about each piece as I bought each piece. Mm-hmm. And then I, reinvested the money and built it up. And that's where my knowledge came from. But now I have trouble retaining information. I am a nightmare for it. Even if I've done a subject on a show 3 weeks ago, I'll have to re-research it because I don't retain the information. Oh, but for some reason, crystals and minerals stick in my head and I remember it. Excellent. So then as time progressed, I started working and realising that when I was working with them, I could feel their energy.
Right.
And then I started being able to I started doing events, I started having enough stock to do events. And then I started to realise that I could pick the right crystal for the right person. Mm-hmm. And just doing it intuitively. And then it just progressed from there. And then I started working crystal grids. And then it's just grown and grown and grown. And it's just really fascinating to me how a rock or a stone can have that kind of energy and that kind of impact. And I've seen it happen. I feel it happen. And it's happened for me, the impact it's had on my life. So I'm a great advocate of crystals and minerals in life. But as I say, the only way I don't work with them is in physical healing. Mm-hmm. I have no interest in doing physical healing at all. I don't know why, but I just feel that that's not for me. But that doesn't I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm not saying it doesn't work, I'm just saying that's just not for me.
No, that's fair enough. Certainly I can relate to what you're saying. I mean, as you know, and our audience has a very large interest, a wide interest in the esoteric and the occult. But the one area that's never interested me at all is astrology. I couldn't even remember which months go with which star signs. It just never had any interest. So there was going to be gaps in what you were interested in. Obviously, it's worth pursuing the stuff that interests you more. But there's a little phrase you sneaked in there that I think people don't know what you mean, and I'll be intrigued to know more about it. What is crystal gridding?
Crystal gridding is basically where you lay a series of crystals out in a geometrical pattern with a specific intention. Now, intention work is used in lots and lots of different ways across the spiritual field, and it's knowing exactly what you want and being 100% sure and being very, very clear so you can send a message out to the universe, and you can do that for just about any intention that you wish to do. And crystal gridding is a way of using the crystal's energy to send that intention out into the universe. And that is basically what it is. It's a geometrical pattern set out with a specific intention to give the message a signal or a message for what you wish to achieve, and use that energy to help you achieve it.
Okay. So where did it come from, that? Is it your own idea, or is it something you've read, or yeah, I'm intrigued.
No, crystal gridding has been around for a long, long time. It's evolved into what it is today, with lots of different types of crystals and lots of different symbols and lots of different patterns and stuff. But crystal gridding effectively started off when you think of something like Stonehenge, although that's not it's a basic crystal grid, because it's got the rocks and stones with granite in it, and it's got quartz in it. So it's laid out in a very specific pattern, in a very specific way, for whatever the intention was at that particular time. So think of something like that. If you think of the of ley lines and how they're gridded out across the world, they're energy lines. Look at all the different, places of interest that are actually put on these specific points on the planet to link into these energy points. So gridding in itself, although it's evolved into what it is in regards to crystal gridding today, the original idea has always been there. Now, there was a movement, I can't remember who did it now, but there is a crystal grid that's at the North and the South Pole. They've put there. Oh, there is. Yes, there is. Now, I first came across crystal gridding from a crystal worker. She's an American lady, and she goes by the name of Hibiscus Moon. And she works with crystals. And that's where I first came across crystal gridding. Now, when I first started looking at her work, that was a brand new concept to me, crystal gridding. But for some reason, how she does her grids didn't suit my particular unique energy signature. So I just took that idea and I evolved it. Now, I use a lot of different things in my grids. I like to use all sorts of organic material like feathers, shells, leaves, all sorts of bits and bobs in my grids, not just crystals, to increase that intention and bring that energy signature, because that's unique to me. That's unique to my energy signature. That's what feels right to me. But we did a ocean healing across the globe. This was lots and lots of different crystal workers were doing this particular event, and we did this on the summer solstice. I can never say that word right.
Well, if you were right the first time, then correct yourself an error.
I know, I do things like that. And what amazed me, we set up a group, and what amazed me was the differences in crystal grids. They were also very different, also very unique, and also very powerful. And it was such a moving event. And we all did it at the same time, and in varying areas. I mean, there were people doing it who are nowhere near the ocean, but were doing their version of it in the desert and stuff like that. It was absolutely astonishing, the variety of crystal grids, but the intention was all geared to the same thing. Now, within days of that event taking place, there was a 16-year-old who actually made a thing to clean the oceans. It was all over social media at one point, but that happened 2 or 3 days after we did that event. So we all like to think we were helping him along with his little invention to clean the oceans, but that was what the intention was put out there for. And it just seemed very synchronicity about how that happened within days of this big global event. So there were people all over the world doing this gridding event, and it just seemed very, very weird how that happened in a very, in a few days. It was literally days after we'd done that event that this 16-year-old, it was a 16-year-old has come up with this contraption to help clean the oceans, and that was snapped up by one of the multi-corporations. So, it just seemed strange at the time. It just was like, oh my God, that happened. We helped make that happen. And I think it just goes to show, when you put the right intentions out there into the universe and you set your head into that intention as well, I think that's a lot to do with it, then what you can achieve. And if you do that on your own, or do you do that as a collective, it can be incredibly powerful. And gridding is one way of doing that. There are lots and lots of different ways of doing it, but gridding and within crystal work is one of the ways you can do it.
Ah, I see. Interesting. You use an important term about the whole synchronicity, but the synchronicity really comes at the beginning with you and your first experiences, when you have an internal idea of something, and then there's an external, almost like a manifestation of that same idea. They appear to occur simultaneously, synchronously, but there's no actual real observable link between the two, i.e. you had the thought and idea from the visit, you then saw a TV program that was advertising them, so that's kind of out there and in you at the same same time. Then you have that reading, which is sort of by the book rather than the interpretation. I seem to be saying the same kind of thing. So that, that's a good example of very real synchronicity personally for you, in terms of what you actually experienced, in terms of your thinking process and ideas, and then it's sort of the world falling into place together to fitting into exactly what you were looking for. So that's absolutely fascinating. But tell me more about the North and South Pole stuff. Where's that come from? Where's the information about that? Because that sounds fascinating. Not something I've heard before, I must admit.
No, that was in this lady's book, Hibiscus Moon's book. She did a crystal gridding book. It was the only book around at the time about crystal gridding. So anybody that wanted to get into crystal gridding was kind of like a captive audience for her, because she was the only one who had actually written a book, and it was referenced in there. And I found that fascinating, that there's one at the North and the South Pole. I need to dig that out, actually, and find out, reread that. But, yeah, that was referenced in her book, and that was something to do with a world movement to try and keep the world balanced and heal the planet. And I believe they're quartz and copper. Okay. I believe they're copper grids, gridding plates, which are basically flat plates with a design printed onto them and quartz put onto them, and they're actually buried at the North and the South Pole. I just think it's a feat that they managed to get to the North and the South Pole to do this.
Well, I'm wondering who on earth actually went there, because it's only ever usually sort of government-backed explorations, or if they're private individuals, they're very public, high-profile. And I'd be interested to know that. I'm not sure she's made it up, obviously, but I'd like to know a bit more about it, as if it actually definitely is the case, because it's certainly a very inhospitable place to sort of stop and bury metal, copper plates and crystals. But it is possible, I suppose. I'd like to know what the design on them would be. Often those sorts of things have symbols from Hindu mysticism. The Sri Yantra is a common symbol that's linked with crystal work, and we probably know what I'm talking about, how it looks. And there are lots of different variations on the Sri Yantra, or there's another one called the Flower of Life, which is another symbol of interlocking patterns that is quite commonly linked with what I've seen used with crystals, certainly. So, but again, you talk about the combination of crystals and copper. Copper does seem to play a big part. A friend of mine's got a huge, it's big enough to sit in, copper pyramid in her house, and it's literally large enough that she can sit inside it, and that's got crystals all attached to that as well. So it is a fascinating idea, certainly, that can have that kind of effect upon you. I mean, we know certainly scientifically, obviously, crystals vibrate because the quartz watches are run by a quartz vibrating, which keeps the time. So there's definitely a vibrational element to crystals, as there is with anything else. But as far as I understand, because the crystal, as it's pure crystal, the frequency remains the same, whereas anything in it can cause a distortion in that vibration. So that's as much as I know for definite about how they appear to be effective. So it's something that you find fascinating, I assume.
Oh, completely fascinating. When you've talked about inclusions inside a quartz crystal, for example...
That's the word I was looking for, thank you.
Inclusions, that's right. All it is basically it changes the vibration. It will still work, but it just changes the vibrations very, very slightly. So that's what makes each individual crystal so unique. So you could walk into a whole room full of amethyst and you would only be drawn... We've used that term quite a lot as well in the crystal world. We get drawn to crystals. You could get drawn just to one specific piece. It could be the smallest, ugliest little crystal or little amethyst cluster in the world, but it could be simply that the inclusion inside that crystal changes that vibration very, very slightly, that links into your own personal, unique energy signature, and that is what will work best for you in your energy signature. That's why you go with what you're drawn to, and then there's no rhyme or reason to this. Like I say, it could be the smallest, ugliest little crystal in the world, but if that's what you're drawn to, that's what's going to work with your energy signature the best.
Absolutely, I understand that.
Yeah. So that's why each crystal has got so many different properties, because different inclusions inside them and stuff. It's fascinating. You could go, and there are thousands and thousands of crystals and minerals.
Tell me more. About more than that. What would be the ones you find the most... What's your most favourite? What's your most useful?
Okay, well, my personal favourite is something called a harlequin quartz. Now, that's basically a quartz crystal, and it has iron oxide inside it, which gives it like little red dots. So it's like little glitter inside the crystal, and they are my absolute favourite crystals in the whole wide world. And I always have amazing meditations when I work with harlequins, because I don't know why. They just work for me. I can't meditate with an amethyst, which a lot of people do. But again, you use what works for you. For me, I found harlequin quartzes work for me. And I first got drawn to them just because they're so pretty. You know what I mean? With these little red dots in the tip, they're absolutely beautiful. Now, that's my personal favourite. The most useful crystal for general use for anybody is amethyst. It's one of the most common crystals that you can get, and it has so many uses. But one thing it is absolutely amazing for is actually it helps to take the emotion out. And emotion clouds things so badly sometimes. It distorts your perception. Your emotions can distort your perception of situations.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you take that out, it helps you on so many different levels. It opens up your psychic centres. It helps take the emotion out, so it helps your perception levels. It calms you. It helps to realign your energy centres. Oh, it's just so many. If in doubt, you get your amethyst out. I use quite a lot of terms, like little key things like this. But if you have no other crystal in the entire world, amethyst is one of the best you can get.
Right. So, what's your most popular in terms of sales then?
Amethyst is always a good seller because it's an eye catcher. It's purple, particularly a good grade. There are so many different grades in amethyst, but if you get a really good grade, the beautiful purple of the amethyst. So amethyst is always a good seller. But generally, you'd be surprised at how across the board it is. You can't ever turn around and say one is more popular than the other. Cost-wise, the best crystal, cost-wise, is probably selenite. That is, for the size pieces you can get for the cost is astonishing. It's a form of gypsum, and it is just wonderfully calming and releasing. And you get nice big pieces in it as well. So, like I say, for a very good cost. So they're great to have around your home because they help the emotional energy and the energy of the home keep flowing. So selenite's really always very popular. And it's a really pretty stone and crystal. I always say stone, cane everybody else for saying stone, and then I use it myself so much.
Well, what's the difference?
It's a really pretty crystal.
Well, what's the difference between a stone and a crystal? I mean, I would imagine that all crystals are stone, but not all stone is crystal.
No, a stone is basically an amalgamation of different forms of minerals within. So you're looking at a stone would have you're looking at granites and marbles and stuff like that, whereas a crystal has a particular lattice makeup inside it that makes it that chemical composition. Right. So there is differences, but we do interchange them quite a lot because you can't keep saying crystal all the time.
It's a little bit like there's a particular kind of crystal they call stone, which is actually, of course, the diamond, often referred to as a stone.
Yes.
And it's almost a slang term for diamond. I assume we don't sell diamonds at all.
I haven't got diamonds for sale, but I do have some Herkimer diamonds, which are they're a really high-grade quality quartz, and they come out of a mine in New York City, and they're called Herkimers, and they're gorgeous. And now and again, you'll get them with like a little black inclusion inside them, which is carbon inside them, but they're really high-grade, and get a really good one, and it looks just like a diamond.
Excellent. So was that New York or York, did you say?
New York.
Oh, New York, as in... Oh, right, okay.
New York.
A mine under New York. Blimey.
Yeah, I know, there's a diamond mine there.
Blimey, I had no idea.
It's not very big.
Well, we've kept it very well hidden. It's in Central Park or something.
I don't know where it is, actually. I think it's more on the outskirts, but it's nowhere near as big as Kimberley.
You also mentioned you've used them in the paranormal. We're going to get back to you talking about the paranormal because I'm interested to know how you got involved in that as well. But you say you've actually used them on investigations?
Yeah, we use them in investigations. This came about by, I started my interest in the paranormal, like most people, by watching TV programmes, Most Haunted and Ghost Adventures.
Those programmes. Oh, God.
I know, but a lot of people have started at that point. And then I met a lady called Kerry Ann, who is also one of our presenters on the other station. And I met her at a holistic event with my crystals. And it was very, oh, hi, how are you? And all this. And then I saw one of her posts on Facebook advertising for people to join a paranormal investigation team that she was running. And I just thought, well, want to do what I see on the TV. Do you know what I mean? I kind of fancy having a go at that.
Of course.
You know, we we got talking, and I said, I have no idea about the paranormal. I've only, read bits and bobs in magazines and stuff. I said, and I'd like to come along if that's okay. And she was like, yeah, because you work with crystals. And I was like, yeah. And so actually, again, it evolved through that connection, through the crystals.
Wow.
And she said, oh, bring some of your crystals along. And I was like, oh, okay. She goes, well, we use pendulums. And I was like, right, okay. And then she goes, and you do gridding. She goes, it'd be interesting to see how gridding works with the intention of opening up the location for activity.
Right,
and that's where, and all kudos to Kerry Ann. She came up with that idea. And I just went, okay, no problem, we'll have a go. And, I'm still working in that field with crystals where I can. And it's, even down to putting crystals on a Ouija board. You lay out a Ouija board, I'll put crystals around the Ouija board to try and help the energy come through, and I'll grid the place, or, sometimes that's a small grid in a hotspot, or that could be gridding the entire location depending on the size of the location, or it will be several different grids that link into one big sort of grid. And then we use pendulums, and then obviously we use dowsing rods, copper dowsing rods, and, all that sort of thing. So it's quite interesting how crystals are working in that field. But it's very, very young. I mean, people take crystals for protection and keep them in their pocket and stuff like that. That's been known for an awful long time. And pendulums have been known for a long time. But working with crystals in that particular way has definitely... We tried it in a location one night with the crystals and crystal gridding. And then the next time we went back, we didn't use any at all. And it was really flat on the night we didn't use them. Now, you can argue that you're going to get good nights and you get bad nights, and it might not have anything to do with the crystal work at all. But it was interesting. It was interesting to see how flat it was without the crystals compared to how active it seemed to be with the crystals.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Sure.
So I love working in that way, because for me, I always, whenever I'm working in that way, I need a tool. I have to use either a tarot deck or crystals or minerals, stuff like that. So for me personally, it's great because I use the tool that I work best with. So, and if it increases the activity for other people, then that's all well and good. It's still an area of trial and error and trying, though, because depending on the location, it depends on what crystals you use. I mean, when I did the True Crimes Museum, I used there were 3 specific sections, and I used very different crystals in each section because of what we were trying to link into, who we were trying to link into. So sometimes it's knowing what crystal to use for the best, to get the best out of the location as well.
Right. I'm just going to say about, obviously, Kerry, just as a pause for a second, if there's someone asks you about you don't think you want to talk about or you're not sure about, just say we won't cover it. But I was interested, you were saying about the idea of using crystals as protection on investigations. That's something I've heard people talk about before as well. And how do you think that actually works? What's your own thinking on that?
Depending on the crystal, each crystal has a very specific energy signature geared towards a particular way that the crystal itself works. So, like, for example, in regards to protection, we would look at black tourmaline or black obsidian or something along those lines. Now, black tourmaline itself, what it does is it actually hardens your auric shield. So it doesn't change your energy at all, but it basically gives you a protective shield around you. So if you work empathically and you get affected by other people's emotions quite a lot, if you start carrying a black tourmaline, you'll notice that you have almost like a invisible barrier in front of you. So when we talk about it in the paranormal field, it helps to prevent you being affected by the energy, whether or not that be an EMF energy or whether or not that be a spirit energy or any of those things. It helps to protect your own auric energy. So they can't use your energy to manifest themselves. You don't want them to suck you dry of energy. We've all been in investigations where we've come over feeling sick or headachy or really
certainly
exhausted in energy. If you start carrying black tourmaline and stuff, the effects of that are greatly minimised, because obviously one tiny tumblestone is minimal to the effect it can give you. You could have 3 or 4 on you and that would have a lot more effect. But it helps to harden your auric shield. So it still gives you a little bit of give. It's not like armour. It doesn't stop everything from coming through, but it definitely helps to strengthen that barrier. And if you're putting yourself in a potentially vulnerable situation, like an unknown situation, like the paranormal field, it's worth doing, because you don't want to have your energy used without your permission. You don't want anything to affect you. You want to be able to maintain your own base, as it were, and then work with the spiritual energy around you in that, or spirits around you, without them making you ill, effectively. So protection is incredibly important. In my opinion, a lot of people don't like protection at all, but crystals can help you. If you don't want to, you can use a black tourmaline to protect your auric shield, but use an amethyst to help open your psychic centres. So it's not going to stop you from working psychically or mediumistically. It will just prevent your energy field from being zapped, basically. And so there are several crystals that will do that, depending on what one works best for you. I mean, a lot of people use black tourmaline. Personally, I work with black obsidian incredibly well. So that, for me, is what, does it for me. If you find yourself getting very fearful on investigations or in situations, then you could use a crazy lace agate. That's going to help take the fear out of the situation for you and help you control that fear, because fear leads to panic, and panic leads to all sorts of misperceptions in circumstances. So you can use crystals in lots and lots of different ways to help you keep your centre controlled and your emotions under control as well.
Excellent. And as you say, there are so many different crystals. I was just enjoying the names they've all got there. You were saying some of them were the crazy lace, was that agate? So
that's right, yeah, crazy lace agate. It's a gorgeous little stone. It's so pretty.
Oh, blimey. I mean, I've heard of agate, but I didn't know there was a version called crazy lace. That's excellent.
There's loads of different agates. Agate is one of the most abundant minerals on the planet, and it's got so many different names depending on the inclusions that it's been born under. So.
Well, it's certainly interesting, the idea that these can offer that kind of protection. And one of the theories, as we've talked previously on other occasions, both on this show and others, the whole notion of what ghosts are, and the idea that they might be from the stone tapes theory, that the building, or the stone of the building is recording them, which would then fit in with the idea of crystals being able to record and change things, but also the idea if they are products of the EM field of a location, which is what I tend to veer towards. But if you've got a crystal that's vibrating at a certain frequency, perhaps that is also affecting the EM field. That at a very, very subtle level of alteration, it is actually creating some kind of change in the environment around you. So I can see it as being a possibility, certainly. Yeah, it's a fascinating idea.
The thing is, you have to be really, when you start looking at this side of it, you have to be really aware that it is a possible increase in electromagnetic fields in the location, because fracking has been proved to increase electromagnetic fields up to like 100 miles away. So has mining, coal mining. That can really affect the electromagnetic fields. And that may not be on the doorstep of the location. That could be like 50 miles away. But if they've been doing some intense mining and all of a sudden you're getting spikes in your electromagnetic fields, do you know what I mean? You need to start looking at things like that. You need to look at the quartz content, the water content. I mean, it's been looked at recently that water holds memory. Look at your water fields. Look at how that is interacting with minerals and crystals, limestone. All those sort of factors are, in my opinion, just as relevant in your research of a location as the history of the actual location.
Definitely. Certainly, again, we talk about the EM field effect of anything that's major done to the landscape, because obviously the ground itself, the environment around us is full of EM fields. They're magnetic fields, effectively, electromagnetic fields, and any distortion of that field is going to be noticeable by whether we are, as individuals, picking up on those changes, or they are much more subtle and deeper, that they are much kind of just having a subtle effect. But again, I mean, if we talk about, I think with ghosts, we are talking about stuff that are subtle energy fields. They're not, the big monsters you see in the horror films. It's just nonsense. They just don't exist that way. But the strange phenomena that we have undoubtedly encountered, you and I have both been on investigations together, but we've both been on investigations and have noticed and felt odd things, that they tend to be rather more subtle. So the idea that the energy around is being affected by something like a crystal, I can see as a definite possibility, as well as, of course, electrical equipment around. I mean, I don't know if you've experienced this before, but in investigations where you've got people videoing and audio recording and there's nothing happening. You have to turn all the stuff off and suddenly things start happening.
Yeah.
Those things are causing such a huge distortion in themselves, so that anything that's much more subtle, like a ghostly presence, is being almost negated or kind of swamped by this energy that's around. So, I mean, we've talked before again about the idea about doing investigations equipment-free. Now, equipment-free would be electronic equipment, but things like crystals would be fit into that. If you're going to go for a more of a kind of Victorian-style investigation with the crystal ball, of course, not your polished glass ball that sits there, then of course that would be an essential element in it anyway. So that would certainly make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing people really forget is that the Earth itself is a living, breathing organism. And if you just sit in or on that organism and just take in that vibration and get used to that vibration, when all of a sudden your phone rings or something happens in regards to tech, you can feel the energy vibrate. You can feel it change. And when you, like you said, when you're on an investigation, you've got all these whizzy gadgets and lights and whirs and goodness knows what else going on from them. It is distorting the energy field itself. So how can you then use the tool that you've got, which is your own body, to feel the energy change, the atmosphere change, which it does when a spirit comes close. The hairs will go up on the back of your neck for no apparent reason. Why? Do you know what I mean? Is that your own fear, or is that because the spirit has changed the energy in the room and your body has actually picked up on that? You know, there are things that you have to look at without the gadgetry, and sometimes it's worth taking the location in and just, before you get your gadgetry out, just take in what you can feel before you begin.
Absolutely. This sort of thing is a much more subtle experience than often people expect. I mean, as you said yourself, you and many, many people got into this because of the TV programs, but they have given quite a distorted view of what is supposed to happen in a paranormal investigation. That, you know, even to call it a paranormal investigation, they're not really investigations. They're us sort of seeing we can pick stuff up. You know, it's almost like it's just an adventure for us rather than anything being scientific. So you want to keep an open mind as to all the different possible things that might happen, but the day you want to have a good experience, and if you're using crystals is actually benefiting that experience, making it more likely to happen, then so much the better. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've also used an incense as well. I make incenses as well as part of my work, and I've actually, you have to be careful because some locations don't like you using it, and obviously if you get strange smells, you can't then say it's down to spirit. You have to go, well, I was burning incense, you know, come on.
Absolutely.
But we found that when I did the crystal gridding and used the incense and stuff like that, again, the energy was incredible. It was really interesting to feel that difference. And it was, you know, this is where we lead into, you know, using all these natural energy vibrations to help raise the vibration of a location, to see if you can increase activity. And it's fascinating to me. I mean, the whole field, I've learned so much in the last few years regarding investigating and my spiritual path as well. And it's lovely to be able to use the two together because it's two passions of mine. And as I say, I've learned huge amounts about the scientific and, you know, the psychology side from yourself and stuff like that. But also, you know, going, okay, so that's a really valid point. How does that fit into what I do, what I learn, what I know about spiritual side? You know, and marrying the two together, because sometimes they almost butt heads, don't they?
Yeah.
You know, like when you start going, oh, hang on a minute, I've not thought about it like that, or I didn't realise that. And then you go, oh, okay, but we can marry that and we can see it in a different perspective and work with it in a different way. And I find that whole thing fascinating. That is just as fascinating to me as purely the scientific side of what science has proven and what we know. Do you know what I mean? I find both sides incredibly fascinating. And sometimes it's great food for thought sometimes.
Absolutely. Great, interesting debate and discussion. I mean, we've been involved recently in a quite lengthy discussion about the idea of what science's role within the sort of ghost paranormal world is. You know, if it's something that is ever going to be demonstrable, are there experts in this field? You know, is it ever going to happen? And we are left thinking, well, you know, let's do what we do. Let's enjoy what we do and worry about the idea of trying to convince anybody else of anything to other people, you know. And if it is giving you that kind of experience of something beyond the ordinary, then great. As I said again, if crystals are playing a part in building that, making that more likely or feel more real, then so much the better. Absolutely.
Oh no, I totally agree. I do not think we will ever be able to recreate paranormal activity in a laboratory. I really don't think we're ever going to be able to do that. I think there's too many factors that come into play in locations to make that phenomena happen. If you record it, which people have done with, Class A EVPs and stuff like that, but then you get shut down by the rest of the community because you can't, they weren't there, basically, is the premise of it all.
Yes.
But if you've gone out and you've enjoyed it and you've gained some, you know what that circumstance was and who was involved and where people were at that particular time, and you capture that, one of the best feelings in the world.
Absolutely. And although we can come up with our own theories or explanations as to why we've seen what we've seen or experienced what we've experienced, we are left with a phenomenon that we can't fully account for. And that's enough to say, well, this is strange, this is a paranormal experience. I don't know exactly what it was. There are lots of theories to explain what it was, but I liked what I experienced. It was good, it was interesting, it was fun. Or scary, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah, and because, there is the two sides to it. You get the one where your heart is pounding with adrenaline because it's that amazing what's going on around you. And then you get the other one where you're thinking, oh, I've got to get out of here because it's really scary.
So,
I haven't had many of them, to be fair.
Well, what would be your most interesting location that you've enjoyed the most, that you've been to?
Oh, goodness me. I think one of the most interesting was, I loved Coal House Fort. I really enjoyed that location. I'd love to get back in there. I've done quite a few I haven't done many of the big overly investigated locations. We've done a lot of smaller locations, but each of them have had their own merit. But I really did enjoy the Coal House Fort, and I would like to have gone back. I'd like to go back actually with the knowledge I've got now, because when I did Coal House Fort, I didn't have the knowledge I have now, if you know what I mean. I've learned a lot more since I did that, and I'd like to go back in and format the investigation a little bit more than it was at the time. So I'd like to do that, but that was really interesting. There was energy all over the place, and it kept changing and moving. So for me, that was fascinating. There was some lovely places, and there were some really strange things. I mean, we had there's tunnels in Coal House Fort, and there was like a room off one of these tunnels, and we actually had a pair of dowsing rods in a wooden block, so nobody was holding them. They were just in the wooden blocks, still. And we were doing a Ouija board, and they moved while we were doing the Ouija board. They crossed. So that was a bit strange, because we spent a lot of time trying to debunk that one. Why did they move? Because there was nobody touching it, and nobody was moving. But we weren't getting anything on the board, but we were getting it through that. So that was fascinating to me. And then we also got a situation where one of my grids got moved.
Right.
It had been set up in one of the officer rooms, and one of the crystals actually got moved out of the grid. And I was like, me and my crystals, I'm like, who touched my grid? And all this. But I know nobody had been in there. So that was interesting to me. I was like, no, you don't touch my grid.
Excellent.
And I got quite cross with the spirit of that one. Don't touch my grids. And no, so that was interesting. But like I say, at the time, I would love to go back with the knowledge I've got now and be able to format that and do that investigation in a lot better way to how we did it. It was more like a ghost hunt we did that night rather than a paranormal investigation. So I'd like to go back and explore that location a bit more, but it's shut at the moment. They're not allowing investigators in. So we shall see on that one, is all I can say.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't realise it was shut. Just to give our listeners a bit of an idea, it's a fort on the Essex coast, where the English Channel and the Thames sort of meet. It was originally built in the Napoleonic times for, obviously, defence against Napoleon's armies trying to invade, though they never did. It was built up further in the First World War because it was used as a gun emplacement site, because we did actually have the occasional Zeppelin come flying over trying to drop bombs on us, and there was actually one that they did actually down in the First World War, which landed in the marshes around Tilbury, and then built again further in the Second World War for similar uses of gun emplacements and preparation for a possible invasion, which thankfully never happened. And I know the location very well. It's about 20 minutes from where I live, and I have mentioned this before, but we'll quickly tell the story again. It's the place I had my own very first paranormal experience when I was about 11, 12 years old. I was We used to go there quite often in the summer on a Sunday, just for picnics. There's a country park around the old fort. And as you say, the fort was open to the public recently. It's been closed for a while, from what you're saying. But back in the early 80s, when I first visiting it, or probably even earlier than then, think about it, late 70s, I suppose it must have been. Late 70s. It was derelict. It was boarded up and surrounded by corrugated iron, trying to keep people out of it, but of course it was full of holes and it was quite easy to get into it. Now the fort itself is circular with buildings around the outside, and there's a large sort of central area within the fort itself, and we're in there, us and a few other kids were in there playing football together. And I distinctly remember, I can even now close my eyes and still picture it. I was just over to one side slightly, and I sort of looked across the ground, and I could see two men walking kind of parallel to where I was, probably about 20 feet away. And the thing that really caught my eye, and it always does, is that they were in like a light brown khaki-coloured uniform, and they had like bandaging around the lower halves of their legs from sort of knee downwards to these large boots, which at the time I had no idea what on earth that was, or who these men were, or why they were there. Now, the place was derelict, it was abandoned. There wasn't supposed to be anybody inside apart from us kids playing football. And this was a sunny summer Sunday afternoon. It wasn't like ghostly and dark and misty and middle of the night or anything like that at all. It was very quite open and ordinary daytime. And they just sort of walked past, and I always remember, and it's a weird sensation, knowing there was something very strange about what I was seeing, but kind of not wanting to see it. Almost like it was somebody else's problem. I don't want to know about that. This strange men walking past. And I remember looking up a second time and they were gone. I mean, they were there the first time and I must have seen for a good few seconds, looked away and looked back, and they were gone. And I thought, oh, that's rather strange.
Yeah.
I headed outside after a little while. I went sort of over to my parents and I told them what I'd seen. And I can't remember my dad or my aunt, because my mum, my dad, my dad's sister, my aunt, and my nan were there. And I said to one of them, and it might be my dad, it might be my aunt, I can't quite remember. I said, oh, no. They said, well, don't be silly, of course there's no one in there. And was left at that. It was only years later I found out that what I'd seen were people in First World War uniform, because that kind of webbing, kind of almost bandaging pattern was part of the First World War military uniform. Now, as I say, there was no sort of war battle there as such, but men were stationed there in order to sort of shoot down the Zeppelins, watch out for invaders. So that was my first ever experience there. And
there was a hospital wing there as well.
I wouldn't have known at that time. I mean, there may well have been one now, but it was more the uniform. It was the First World War soldiers' webbing uniform that they have around to prevent sort of mud getting to them from the trenches. As I know, it's a standard kind of uniform that was dropped by the time the Second World War came along, but First World War uniform, that was very much how it looked.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing location. If you get a chance to go, I would recommend it. I think it's open for public to look around, but it's not open for public paranormal investigations now. So they do recreation work. They even do Saving Private Ryan. Mm-hmm. Some of that was filmed there as well.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah, apparently so. Yeah, I got told that whilst I was there.
Okay. I know they'd filmed part of Batman. One of the Batman films was filmed.
Yeah, so it's been used. It's great. I love it there, and it's. I used to visit there as a child as well, but to get the chance to go inside and do the investigation was great. I loved it. But there's so many different locations that I've done, and so we tend to do the smaller, non-over investigated locations. We did a pub that wasn't far from there called the World's End, and through this spirit box we heard very, very distinct drumming, and then it sounded like it was getting closer and closer and closer, and everybody around the table was sort of looking at each other going, okay, what's going to happen next, because it felt like it was building. And then we heard a bugle sound.
Way.
And that was something else as well.
Excellent. What's the would you say there was a scariest place you've been to that really spooked you the most, or had no one in particular done
that? We did a pub in Kent. I can't tell you the name of it because they won't allow people in now. But that was quite scary. I was very, very green around the ears, working in a psychic way that I hadn't worked with a more experienced medium before. And that really did scare me. That was the only time I would say on an investigation I've actually been terrified, and I wouldn't go back there.
Could you say more about what particularly happened, or would you rather not?
We were working on... We had a lady spirit come through who was basically quite distressed and wanted to... We were trying to move her over, trying to allow her to move over, but she was being held. This actually leads very nicely into what we're going to go on to talk about. Because I've had this a couple of times. Now, this lady, it was being held by another male spirit in, earthbound, basically, and she wanted to be moved over. So the more experienced medium had hold of the male spirit and was trying to hold him back, and I was trying to move the female over through to the other side, through to the light. Anyway, literally, it just, whilst we were, it was very, very intense. Things were very, very tense. It was incredibly difficult. As I say, the whole atmosphere was very, very intense. And we were trying to, there were people trying to do spirit boxes and stuff at the same time, trying to capture this. And it was all very, very murky, I suppose is the expression.
Yeah, right.
And then literally within a split second, they both went. And I went into fight or flight mode. And I went into fight mode because that's the kind of girl I am. And I was just like, where have they gone? They've gone. And I knew they hadn't gone far, but I needed to help this woman. I was in full help mode. And I went into the next room. I rushed off into the next room because that's where we felt that they were. And the medium followed me, but the team stayed in the original room. So it was only me and him in this room. And literally, as soon as I stepped into this room, this male energy was on me. And I was shaking, like I was literally pinned to the spot, shaking like a leaf, not knowing how to deal with this because I'm so inexperienced at this point. And this was like a little learning lesson on what not to do when you're confronted by a spirit like this. And anyway, the more experienced medium came straight over and tried to take the male spirit off of me. And as he did so, the energy blast that hit both of us threw us both across the room.
Oh,
and
blimey.
the medium himself got quite badly hurt, and we had to leave it. Anyway, afterwards, it really upset me. The fact that he got hurt, the fact that I couldn't do what I needed to do for this female, the whole experience scared me because it also showed me how powerful spirit energy can be when it wants to be. Do you know what I mean? Because I'd always been I can handle it, I can deal with whatever, you know what I mean? But when it actually comes at you like that, it really was a learning lesson for me to be very aware of what can happen. Now, I've got the audio to that, and even now, with the knowledge I've got now, I listen to that and think, I still can't tell you exactly whether or not that was, or what that was. Do you know what I mean? When I look at it, there are certain factors in it that are psychological. There are certain factors in it that are, I can look at it in different ways, but I still can't, in my head, I still know what happened. And after that investigation, it took me a long time to get over that. I went and had healing and shamanic healing, and I talked it over with my friends, and it almost felt like I don't use this term lightly. It felt like I'd been raped.
Blimey.
It really was incredibly intense experience. I mean, I was crying for days afterwards. It really, really upset me on a lot of levels, and I wouldn't go back there now. But we did send another team in to see if they got the same thing. They didn't. But this leads very nicely, is because I've had this before in a pub in Canewdon, where we had a female spirit being hampered and held by a male spirit. And it transpired that through a different medium, nothing to do with me, this was a medium working, I wasn't even investigating, we were there for a completely different reason. And she was working, and she said that this is a witch, and she was being held there by this male energy, so she can't be reborn, basically. And this is like 3 times, actually, I've come across this. One was this pub in Canewdon, which was completely unconnected to anything of my working that this medium had said. Then I had that at that particular pub, and it would fit how a female is being kept by the male spirit and will not allow the female to be moved over no matter what. And then there's a castle down in Wales that somebody was talking about, and there was a female spirit being held by a male that was supposed to be a witch. So it's an idea. I'm not saying it happens. I'm just saying it's a theory that maybe that is one of the things that is happening. I don't know. It's a little theory of mine.
It's an interesting theory. I think interesting is the word I would probably stick with.
It just seems strange that you've got these females that are all supposed to be like witches that are being held by male spirits and not being allowed to move over for whatever reason. I don't know. I don't know.
I think we're going to get into the next part of our show in a moment, and you've very nicely segued us into Canoodan because it plays a particularly important role in the next part of our show. So I think what we'll do, we can take a break for a moment and a bit of the old advertising, and we can have a quick refreshment break of our own and get back into the second part of our show. How does that sound?
That sounds fantastic.
Hello, this is Lord Lewis Smythe, formerly of the House of Lords and World Traveller, and I have visited some of the darkest, scariest places on Earth. But nothing is as frightening as listening to Paranormal UK Radio with the lovely Irene Allen Block and that American chap Mark Johnson. So tune in every Wednesday night from 10 to midnight here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Okay, guys, we are back, having had our obligatory adverts. We are now back talking. We were talking about paranormal investigating, as well as having discussed crystals and their use in investigating. We were just talking briefly there about a particular investigation you were involved in, Kerry, in Canoodan.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell me a bit more, just the background to that investigation, because that did sound fascinating, and obviously there are reasons why we're going to talk about Canoodan specifically in a moment, but just tell me a bit more of the background to how it all came about.
Well, it wasn't an investigation. What it was before, when I worked full-time, I worked for a company called Olympus that make scopes that go into engines. They're called boroscopes and fibroscopes, and they go into engines to try and find the little places, like the tiny little scopes. And they use them in the medical field as well, like tiny little peephole and keyhole surgery. That's the word I was searching for there. Anyway, we've been called in by the pub because a medium had been in and had said there's something behind this wall. So they wanted us to go in, basically drill a hole, have a look with our scope to see if there was actually anything behind the wall. So that's why we were there. I wasn't there in a paranormal world at all. I was there on a work front and with this scope. And whilst we were there, the medium actually arrived. And when she came in, it was like it's behind the wall. Anyway, we had the scope in and we couldn't find anything behind the wall apart from the usual builder's rubble and stuff like that. And she ended up going into or being took over by a spirit. And that transpired that it was the woman, and she was saying, help me, help me, help me. And I did an amazing thing. I reverted back to my horror movies, and I was sitting there going, just go towards the light, just go towards the light, not having a clue what I was doing, trying to get this medium to come round and get rid of this energy that was with her. I had no idea what I was doing at all. Anyway, we was crying afterwards because it was such a poltergeist moment. Anyway, we managed to get this lady out, but whilst she was in this trance, she was going, he's coming, he's coming. And then this male energy came forward and said, you're not having her. And then literally this medium just slumped to the ground. And we had to get her out of the place. We didn't. And then we sort of like packed her kit up, all looking at each other going, oh, that was an experience. But there was nothing behind the wall. So that was the experience I had at the pub in Canoodan. Now, the interesting thing is the pub itself is situated literally 50 foot from the gate of Canoodan Church.
Oh, okay.
Now, I've actually had the pleasure to actually be allowed into the church to work in a spiritual way.
In Canoodan Church itself?
Inside the church itself.
Blimey.
And that, I know, I was incredibly privileged to do that. Not many people get that opportunity.
No, definitely not.
And I say I was incredibly blessed to be able to go in there and see what I felt. And that was incredibly interesting. There was picked up on a male energy, a gentleman named John, and there was also a energy vortex in there as well, which I hate using that word. It was a hot spot, I suppose you would call it, which was an old well, which you'd never know it was a well. You'd never know it was a well from where I picked it up. Yeah. And there's underneath, the whole basement is basically the crypt. Yeah. And there's like dead bodies all underneath it. But one thing, there's an old legend that was quite interesting to me. I was being talked to by this person. I can't tell you who that person was, obviously. But he said apparently there's a witch that is buried on the gate, by the gate, as you enter the church. And he said the common misconception is that it's a female, and it isn't. It's a male.
How does he know that?
I don't know. In all honesty, I don't know. And it's not a marked grave at all. In fact, where he pointed was just like a bush. That it doesn't look like a grave, not like some of the other graves in there at all. And he said it was the head of a coven, and it was a male witch.
Well, that's interesting, although not very interesting. Because, of course...
I'm only repeating what I was told.
No, that's fair enough. But, of course, Canoodan is very, very famous for one particular male witch, which is really the topic of our next sort of part of the show, where we are talking really kind of about witchcraft and the likes. Probably more in a kind of Essex perspective, I think, is one way you could look at it. The idea of the value and importance of Canoodan, because there is a kind of connection to witchcraft and magic when it comes to crystal work as well. It's played its particular feature. But as we know, one of the most famous sort of characters for Essex witchcraft is a chap called George Pickingill. Now, George Pickingill is said to have been a witch living in Canoodan, of course, which is I wonder if that is who this particular person of whom you are speaking was referring to. Now, they are buried in the Canoodan churchyard, I do believe, but I also think they might not have a marked grave, so it could well be that that's the person they were alluding to. But there are problems with Mr. Pickingill and the supposed early days of witchcraft and his apparent involvement. Now, we need to rewind a little bit before we go too far. We'll go back to what we were talking before very briefly about the idea of magic and the use of crystals. The UK real and only real contribution to world religion is the birth of a religion that is now known as Wicca. Which began really in the 1930s by a chap by the name of Gerald Gardner, who basically wanted to bring back what he believed, or claimed at least, was ancient witchcraft practices from around the UK from ancient times and revive an old tradition, an old witch cult that was said to have existed in this part of the world. There are quite a few problems with those claims. First and foremost, some of the ideas are based on an article written by a woman called Margaret Murray, who was an archaeologist, who at the turn of the last century published an article in the Folklore Society journal in which she outlined her belief that there were groups of organised witch cults that existed across Europe, really, that were largely unchanged, that had been going on for centuries with all sorts of regulations and practices that have been kind of hidden away. Now, she wrote the article, and initially it was accepted as being a good scholarly piece of work, but unfortunately a lot of her assumptions and a lot of the supposed detail in the article didn't check out with other researchers. And despite that, she ended up writing a book on a similar subject, which had become quite influential in terms of people's understanding of what they thought witchcraft was about. But again, it's full of errors and inaccuracies, which is a real shame, because Margaret Murray was quite a consummate archaeologist, particularly writing about ancient Egypt. But this desire to create an idea of the existence of a strong continuing witchcraft lineage in the world, or the UK and Europe, I should say, was interesting because it just didn't add up. There was just too many holes, inconsistencies in the theorising. But it kind of set up the notion that there should be a historic witchcraft movement in the country that could be brought back to life, that there were ancient mysteries and rites that were still being handed down through generations of covens, leaders and followers forming their own covens. Again, there's very little evidence of anything organised like this. There is certainly evidence that there have been witchcraft practices throughout the centuries that is quite genuine, and the other side of it, they call it cunning craft, the counter witchcraft material, also definitely exists. But Gerald kind of put together his own movement, which was a kind of rebirthing of these ideas. Now, he claimed that he was in contact with a woman called Dorothy Clutterbuck, who lived in the New Forest where he was living at the time, and essentially she passed on to him and gave him records and rituals and magical practices that the coven was supposed to be involved in. He first of all wrote a book, a kind of fictionalised account of his experiences of meeting with these groups, and sort of talked about the arcane knowledge that was passed on to him. But what happened, there was a change in the law to do with, actually, Fraudulent Medium Act changed the status of witchcraft, and you didn't have to be quite so secretive anymore. You could be more public about stuff. You could actually say more publicly what you're involved in. So he started writing books that were much more kind of factual, shall we say. Witchcraft Today was one of the earliest books he wrote, again outlining his version, if you like, of an ancient witchcraft practice which he kind of claimed it still existed. That's probably in 1954. And it's Margaret Murray's own book was A Witch Cult of Western Europe, came in 1921, which, as I say, he kind of based his ideas upon. But there was this almost need to create a kind of lineage, a history, a prehistory of the movement going back centuries, which didn't really need to happen, and two, didn't really exist. But he felt the need to create that, because, I say, this Clutterbuck lady that he's supposed to have learnt the magic from has never been found or identified. She remains a bit of a mystery. When you look at Gerald Gardner's own ideas, you can see elements of other organisations that certainly did exist at the time. People like the Golden Dawn, which the Mythic Order of Golden Dawn are a Victorian high magic group who were practising forms of Kabbalistic magic, and themselves were kind of in the same sort of boat as in trying to find a historic lineage to their existence. They claimed that their own magical system was inherited from a German organisation, which was basically a German translation of the word Golden Dawn. It was a Golden Dummerang, something along those lines. And that they've been given the permission because they discovered these secret manuscripts hidden inside a book that was bought in Portobello Market. They contacted the German organisation, who they said had become defunct at the time, and they were happy and willing to allow the British or English organisation to continue the Golden Dawn's work. Now, again, complete nonsense. The German organisation didn't exist. The woman they wrote to didn't exist. The actual documents were probably put together by early members of the Golden Dawn, and they were the creators of it. So, but you have the same idea of you had to have ancient origins for this sort of material. And so the same is true of Gardner, the idea that it was Dorothy Clutterbuck's coven that was the information he was using to form the Wicca movement. Now, another name that pops up as being a kind of influence upon Gardner is a guy who's mentioned before, George Spickengill. So this is kind of going in a bit of a large circle. We're getting back to where we're supposed to be, talking about mainly about George Spickengill and the history of the supposed witchcraft in Canoodan, which is why it's quite interesting you brought onto that already, talking about this stuff going on with supposed witches. Now, the story goes that he was this powerful magic person who was not averse to using darker crafts to get what he wanted, and he was in charge of a number of covens that were based in and around the Canoodan area, which is all very interesting, and was catalogued by a chap called Eric Maple in the 1960s, who wrote articles for the Essex Countryside magazine about the supposed activity of George Spickengill, then controlling a number of witch covens in the area, including apparently at one point one of the witches was apparently the wife of the vicar, which seems a little bit unbelievable. But what's really interesting is if you start to dig down into his actual own life during his lifetime, there's very little written, if anything at all was written about the idea that he was actually directly involved in poke magic or witchcraft of any kind at all. It seems to be he was very much the kind of person who liked publicity, liked to be sort of seen with exciting things. The first sort of nice car that turned up in the Canoodan village, he was photographed standing, or was depicted to be standing beside it. He was over 6 foot tall, which was an incredibly high height for anybody of those that time, and lived probably till he was about 90. It's hard to say exactly because there's various different claims made about his age, exact date of birth, etc. has been hard to really track down. So it's suggesting he was born around about 1806 and died about 95 years later. The interesting thing is, I say, there's nothing really to link him directly to witchcraft or magic prior to Eric Maple. It all seems to have started around about the time when Eric Maple was writing his articles in the 1960s. And it's been one of those things that's been almost accepted that this guy really was this strange magical man without it really being challenged. But so it was first popularised by, as I say, Eric Maple, talking to locals and the residents of Canoodan about life in the Canoodan in the previous century and sort of the early parts of the 20th century. And as I say, he put articles together to put in the Countryside magazine, which were then published. And he went on to write a book called The Dark World of Witches in 1962, which continued to contain the claims that Spickengill was some great magician or wizard leading of these various witch cults and groups. Spickengill himself came to a more wider attention, as I say, because of Eric Maple's books and articles, but there is a real problem when you look at what he claims about Pickingill, because it's difficult to find anyone who actually verifies the same kind of claims at the same sort of time. Now, of course, you're talking about a local folklorist. Eric Maple was from Essex, and he's compiling information. But what's particularly interesting, and myself and a friend of mine who's written a lengthy article on this as well, has noticed that if you look at what is claimed of George Pickingill in terms of his activity, without getting all the lots of details about it, if you look at another man by the name of James Cunning Murrell, who lived in Lee but had strong connections with Canewdon because he had family there, their activity is remarkably similar. Except the problem is, James Murrell lived about 50 years before, or was active about 50 years before Pickingill. And it has been my suspicion, and others also have the suspicion, that in actual fact that the two people have been mixed up. And that this person that has been pointed out as having been influential in the formation of Wicca, i.e. George Pickingill, may actually have no direct connection with witchcraft or magical practices at all, and it's actually been completely mixed up. In the 1970s, another writer called Bill Liddell attempted to try and verify and solidify this claim that Pickingill was linked directly with the birth of Wicca. But without again going into too much detail, you can find the article online. He goes through a kind of strange kind of twisting of what is known and starts to link Pickingill with all sorts of other groups, including trying to link him in with people like Aleister Crowley and saying there's a Crowley influence in the Wicca movement. Now, there's a chance that probably Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner probably did meet and had conversations, and I can imagine they probably had some quite heated discussions, but there is a kind of almost wish to verify and validate the whole idea of George Pickingill having a big influence on the Wiccan Gardnerian Wiccan tradition. And the mantle has been picked up by other writers more recently who again pushing that similar kind of idea. But it's almost as if no one's really sat down and thought, well, let's just make absolutely sure that we can actually find the direct evidence that this guy is actually the man he was supposed to be. Because there doesn't seem to be very much written at the time prior to Eric Maple in the 1960s. Now, I've got some older books here that I've used in my research and the book I've written, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But some of those books are from the 1910s and 1920s, and they talk about witchcraft practices in Essex, and there is not a single word about George Pickingill. James Murrell, on the other hand, crops up a number of times, and as I say, it describes, without going into all the detail, describes various activities that Murrell may well have been involved in that then are claimed to have been the work of Pickingill. So you've got people writing around about the same time, including articles in local newspapers. There's one particularly in Chelmsford published at the time of James Murrell's life, which was in the mid-1800s, talking about his activity as a cunning man, which, well, I'll talk about that in a minute, that's exactly what the hell a cunning man is. But, they're actually written at the time. There were proper newspaper articles about this strange, mysterious man living down in the Leon Sea, and Hadley, I should say, and what he was up to. So, but there's nothing contemporary for Pickingill other than the stuff with Eric Maple popping up in the 1960s. So it's interesting that there's this desire to create a history to things to make it seem more valid, and yet probably the most important figure in that history has been completely ignored, and all his activities have been given to somebody else, which is a real shame. It's unfortunate, because some sort of the more leading lights, shall we say, without mentioning any names, Professor Ronald Hutton, have been really pushing this particular theory. Because my friend Richard Ward, who was on the show last month, we were talking about psychic questing and occult book collecting, he also has written an article about this whole notion. He'd also written an article talking about the same kind of thing, where he'd noticed the strange similarity between the activity of the two men and the fact that Murrell was 50 years prior to Pickingill, approximately. And the idea that he had family connections with Canewdon, whereas Pickingill supposedly controlled these covens in Canewdon. But again, there's very little evidence, almost none at all, of this organised coven activity prior to the foundation of Wicca. There really is little evidence. There was a little bit, but not very much. As you know, and I have mentioned in previous shows, I have currently written a book which is a compilation of so-called magical spells, charms, incantations that were recorded mainly in the Victorian age, so we're talking very much about this time, And none of them really talk about groups or covens. They're always based about individual activity, battling against a witch, not a coven of witches. Spells to break the witch's curse, those kind of things. Spells to break the evil eye of a witch, not a powerful collected coven of witches, just an individual active. So I think prior, really, until the rise, as I say, of Wicca in the 1930s and 40s, and then its real kind of explosion in the 50s, if you like, there wasn't any organised grouping of religious spiritual or cunning men or magical activity. There was no group covens in operation. It was lots of small individuals basically doing their own thing until, as I say, the 1960s, when Eric Maple started writing what he wrote.
Well, it's a fair point, because also when you look at the ritualistic side of things and you start looking at various rituals that came up around that time, that involved more people than just somebody doing their own thing in a cunning way. Do you know what I mean? So that would then reinvent that myth of a coven, because you would need a certain amount of people to do this ritual with for certain reasons. And, and this is where we come between the high magic and the low magic. Could you explain that a little bit, please?
Well, absolutely. That really does sort of nail things on the head. Yes, I mean, it's an important question, because high magic, if you like, is more ritual-based. It's more organised. It's, as I say, the likes of the Golden Dawn I spoke of briefly earlier. Now, the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn emerged in the late 1800s as a magical fraternity that was basically using material that was gleaned from the Rosicrucians, originally, mythically, if you like, but more accurately, more truthfully, from Freemasonry. Some of the Freemason libraries contained records of some possible magic, ritual magic. Others were kind of put together themselves, but based around what they believe was the activity of the ancient Kabbalists and Jewish mystics, and put together to form the system of the Golden Dawn's Hermetic magic. Again, it doesn't have the real history that they like to claim it has. As I say, this idea of the German order. Anna Spriegel, that was the woman's name. That the organisation that she was heading had almost closed down, and that somehow the documents, the cipher manuscripts as they became known, were hidden in the back of a book, and these documents are found inside, although in reality they probably were written by the Golden Dawn founders, but again wanted to create this sort of fake prehistory of their organisation. And that sort of is high magic in itself. It's ritual based, it's group activity, it's to connect with higher beings, higher purposes, etc. To be at one with God and the universe, whatever way you want to define those things to be. It does have its basis very much in Freemasonry, and certainly its grades and orders that mimic that of Freemasonry from sort of throughout the centuries, if you like. And its organisation structure follow those kind of lines. Indeed, some of the information probably came from an organisation called the Rosicrucian Society of Anglia, which is, again, it's Freemason, but it's probably the most mystical Freemason group. But whereas a lot of the Freemasonry like to study these manuscripts, they don't tend to do anything with them. Whereas the Golden Dawn wanted to be an active, practical, magical order. And, as I say, they were founded in 1888, and they flourished for about 20 years as a proper, fully structured organisation, but the things kind of fell apart a little bit when some of the original founders get a little older, and it splintered into a number of groups, and now there are lots of groups who call themselves the true original Golden Dawn, etc., etc. But one of the individuals who did emerge from the Golden Dawn and very much became the antithesis of the Golden Dawn was Aleister Crowley, whose most famous activity with the Golden Dawn was to publish all the Golden Dawn manuscripts in a series of books he called the Equinox, which essentially is a hardbound magazine, if you like, as it would be today. But that came out over a couple of years, and it contained most of the main ritual work of the Golden Dawn. And in actual fact, as a little side story, the Golden Dawn members took Crowley to court for breach of copyright, and unfortunately they didn't copyright the material themselves. So Crowley won, basically, because there was no copyright for him to be breaching. So their information became more public. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because it became the foundation of how to form your own magical order, if you like, a magical organisation. And there is some debate whether Gerald Gardner was actually a member of the Golden Dawn or one of the Golden Dawn offshoots later on, or was not. But certainly he definitely seems to have had access to that information, because some of the rituals, if you look at where they're written down, there are parallels to the kind of thing that Golden Dawn do. That's a nice one. Golden Dawn do. So there certainly are parallels to what they actually do. So, but again, I think because the Golden Dawn had this desire to kind of create this prehistory, the Anna Spiegel and the German organisation, which also ties into the theosophy of the sort of the same kind of time frame. That theosophy couldn't just appear out of the blue; it had to have a great ancient antecedent, so it had to come from somewhere. So all this kind of desire to have a backup, a prehistory to a particular movement is very much part and parcel of how these things come together. So the Wicca movement had to have a background to it, and as I say, you have this pretty much invented story of him of Gardo taken along to some secret organisation, some secret meeting, secret coven, and was able to find information about, and was told to keep it to himself, but then decided to form a religion based around it. One of the big things, as you might know, is this whole notion of being skyclad, i.e. sort of doing rituals with no clothes on. The fact that has some strange link with the fact that he was very much into nudism. He was very much a naturist. That was probably the reason why that plays a particularly big part in some of his early ritual work, because he was actually into that kind of thing before. So you do find he's bringing his own personal preferences into the foundation of what is effectively a religion. And that's probably the big difference. With Wicca, you're talking about an actual religion. It has a belief system. It has a god and a goddess that are worshipped in ritual. But there is an idea that they are supreme divine beings. Now, when you get to what you might call proper witchcraft, which I know Wiccan fans will probably hate that, me using that idea, but that isn't a religion. It's not. It's a way of life, if you like. It's a belief system, certainly, but it's not codified as some kind of religious at the height of power, etc. You can be a practicing of a religion, but use witchcraft practices yourself, and there's not necessarily completely conflicting with each other. So that's one of the big differences between the high and low magic. High magic tends to be more about divine power and will and etc., and is more organised, more structured. Low magic is about working with the world around you. Now, this again is one of the problems with Wicca. It is kind of ritual based, and it does ritual implements, and you're doing rituals for this reason, that reason, but it's closer to the landscape, if you like, closer to the world around you, but not making direct use of it. Whereas sort of a more real witchcraft, if you like, is more connected to the world around, and goes back to what we were talking before at the beginning about energy. There is a definite connection there with working with energies of the land. Now, we talked about Ian Fields earlier on. That could be exactly what they're talking about, because there is definitely a connection there. The idea of manipulating energies around you, creating a feeling around you by what you're doing, and enabling a change in the local environment. And you've seen that happen yourself. And we had a visit to a rather interesting wood called Clapham Wood on the south coast a couple of months back. There was definitely appeared to be something happening around what we were doing. So,
yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
I was expecting you to continue then. When we was in the wood, you're talking about...
Is there anything you want to add to that particular? I don't want to go into too much detail about it.
Sorry. No, there is a very big difference between the ritualistic side of it and being very precise in, exactly how you are supposed to perform the ritual, to actually working with the energy and flowing with the energy and actually working in a much more natural way between the two. So, yeah, there is a huge difference between the two. And I think it's almost like with the ritualistic side, it's quite involved. And you need specific tools and in very specific substances and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And it can be quite costly, in all honesty. So, when most people nowadays, like the common people, I suppose you'd like to look at it, tend to work more naturally, work more with the earth and what's on hand and what they can forage and what they can use and what's accessible to them. Mm-hmm. So, there is a very, very different way of working under the same kind of banner.
Yes, absolutely. That's the kind of difference that we're talking about here. Now, certainly people, even like Cunning Merrill, would be using what was to hand, if you like. Well, he was probably most famous for creating the witch bottles, which are used to basically break the spell. Now, it would be a mistake to... We can't... Just back to track a little bit. People do tend to talk about... George Pickingill as a witch, or sort of witch father, or whatever you put it. Whereas there's no way on earth you'd ever call Cunning Merrill a witch. If anything, he's battling against witchcraft and practices along those lines. His idea was to try and help you defeat that negative energy. Now, of course, you can argue that, well, maybe it didn't exist in the first place, and he was just kind of conning people and saying, oh yeah, this has gone wrong because you're under the spell of a witch or something along those lines, and here is a way of freeing yourself from that kind of dark practice. But he would certainly be known for creating the witch bottles, which are often made of iron and were made by a local forger. They would contain various elements of the person who you were trying to help. And the idea was it was contained within that bottle, that was then put on the fire, and eventually the bottle would break, and it would break the spell of the witch or person who had cursed you. So that's kind of the difference there, that one is more based around anti-witchcraft, if you like, whereas something like Picking You're seen as being a witch. So you get this kind of almost like a mixture of the different ideas at the same time of, while we're talking about witchcraft as a negative evil practice against bad, causing bad things to happen, which is how people tend to perceive witchcraft as being from its name, or are we talking about the birth of a religion, which Wicca is primarily a religion rather than a magical practice now. So
but they all get very muddled and very it's very, it gets very lost, doesn't it, in the midst of time where all these things come in, but you can find the strains that come through. I mean, the other thing between George and James was very solitary. He works very solitary, whereas George is always linked to groups.
Yes, exactly.
So you have got that separation between the two people, even though there's not anything tangible to grasp to with them. Yes. There are a lot of parallels, but a lot of non-parallels as well. It's enigma.
Absolutely. Well, it's easy for us in the 21st century to sit and talk about organisations of groups and witches coming together. People didn't do that kind of thing. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the resources to sort of get together in secret without people finding out what was going on. It's like you get several strangers suddenly turn up in the village. You're going to notice that, people you haven't seen before. And you notice strange gatherings of people that go sort of around someone's house or around a barn of the night time. People are going to notice. Canoodle's a village. It's not even a town. It's very small. But yet very few people seem to have ever identified or have come forward and said that they actually saw this stuff. It was almost like when you read a lot of second or third hand stories. Well, I heard this, that my uncle said that this is supposed to have happened. My great aunt saw this, and my grandfather said that to Picking-Gill. And it's like, well, who's actually said it directly? Interestingly, though, another person who's written a lot about this, who still stands very much by the idea of George Picking-Gill being this famous witch figure, actually said that he visited Canute himself and interviewed a woman who actually knew him, George Picking-Gill, and she confirmed some of the things that had been said about him. The problem was that the person who we're talking about would have been 14 when he went to interview this woman, and the idea the woman might have just told him stories because it was an old woman telling stories to a young boy. He was a school kid interested to know about these things. You think, well, is she going to be giving a full and accurate, detailed description of what she actually knew, or is she going to tell him a few little stories because he's a kid? So again, it's not very rigorous. It's not very detailed in terms of identifying what was actually supposed to be going on. So. No,
it's not. But I know the village, and I know people in the village, and there are still practising witches in Canewdon, and they maintain their witchcraft history and stand by it firmly. And there's more than one. I know this as a fact. I'm not prepared to divulge names, obviously, but it is something that they do. But I do think it goes back to. It's almost like a fashion, though. Do you not find these days? Absolutely. It's almost like a fashion, and a lot of if there is historic knowledge, when you think about the Canewdon witch trials, and George Picking-Gill is supposed to be buried there, and there's a lot of history there, and it's a fascinating history, and it makes somebody seem more interesting than they necessarily are, and they may well work in a witchcraft way. I'm not saying that they don't, but it's that mysteriousness. It gives them that air of self-importance a little bit.
Absolutely.
I don't mean that rudely or disrespectfully to anybody, but particularly living in that location as well. I'm a Canewdon witch. It's do you know what I mean? It gives you that basis, and because it has got that history, it kind of backs you up. You don't hear people going, "I'm a Hadley witch." You know what I mean? In regards to James. James Morrell. So it's almost like, I find, it's almost like a little fashion thing to want to class yourself as that. I mean, there's lots of people that work in that kind of way that wouldn't class themselves as a witch, but basically what they're doing is a basic witchcraft thing. You know, working with, like myself, crystals and herbs and stuff like that. You could class me as a witch. I would never class myself as that, but because of what I do and the way I do it, people would look at it in that way. But that's not what I would class myself as in any way, shape or form. But in regards to the Canadian thing, I think that's very much the connection to history that they like, the notoriety, is that the word, notoriety of it?
Notoriety, isn't it? Yeah.
That's the word. Yeah, so thank you for that.
But that's what I would say to you, those who claim to be witches who live in Canooden, ask them to demonstrate that they've been around anything later than the 1960s, because you won't find anybody that goes back further than that. It was a very, very... You would not even admit or confess to have been involved in witchcraft in those days, because you would have been locked up. This is why the cunning man and wise woman, cunning woman title kind of came into play, because if you call yourself a witch, you're in trouble. If you call yourself a cunning man, you're useful, because you're helping defeat witchcraft and bad practices. So those who claim to be witches who live in Canooden, I would challenge them to prove that they've ever been such before, say, the 1960s at the absolute earliest, because they don't exist, because you start to claim to be part of something because that something is well known. Oops, sorry. You claim to be part of something because that's something that's become well known because of later writings. You know, that's the key.
Very much so. I mean, it's, as I say, I find it almost a fashion thing, and because it links into that history, it gives you that level of notoriety, and you know. But we have had recently, in the last 10 years, a huge resurgence of people working in what would be classed as a witchcraft way openly. Yes. I mean, you see it all over the place, which, you know, is now a very common word for somebody to describe themselves as, because they're working energy in whatever way, shape or form. And, you know, it started in the 60s with Gerard Gardner and all this, but it's leapt now into the more modern field where people are using all different tools and you know, natural substances and classing themselves as witches. I mean, you're seeing courses coming up now to be a practicing witch. I mean, it's nearly as bad as the paranormal courses.
Yes,
that you can do. And this has sort of happened in the last 10 years, and it's a badge worn with pride now, whereas you don't have to hide it.
No,
so
exactly.
So that's the other side of it. People don't have to hide it. You can be what you want to be and work in the way you want to work and not have that stigma placed on you. So there's lots of different factors coming into play with this.
Absolutely. As you say, it's because it's become almost...
Sorry.
And of course, it's become just acceptable. It's just another sort of belief system that people want to adhere to, using a term that I think sometimes people don't necessarily know what it actually means. Because, you know, when researching my book on sort of charms, incantations and magic, the genuine examples that were actually recorded by these are actually genuine examples that were recorded by Victorian folklorists who were actually writing sort of myths and legends and stories, but also including actual proper spells and charms, incantations. And the witch is seen very negatively in that sort of time frame. So, you know, people are kind of using that terminology as, because it's got a bit shocking, and you can't be a witch, that's evil, you're dark, you're sinister, you're black magic people, you know. So it is kind of a way of sort of identifying yourself as being outside of the norm, if you like. I'm different, I'm a witch. Without necessarily saying, well, what actually do you mean by that term? You know, well, I grow herbs and make herbal remedies. Well, okay, so you're a herbalist. No, I'm a witch. Yeah. Okay.
It's like I say, it's very, people are muddling it all. But then this has been the point from day dot with this. People have muddled it and diluted it and taken bits from other things and changed it and made it their own, you know, and then it changes again. And the real roots of it all, excuse me, has kind of been forgotten.
This is part of the problem, as we were talking before, sort of our preparation to do the show, is you can't, going back in time to try and find the origin even of the term witch is pretty difficult to get a good defined definition of what exactly that term is meant. I mean, some people like to use the term pagan, for example. Well, pagan only actually means the dweller on the edge of the village. It's pretty much all it means. You know, it's difficult to actually get a good precise definition, whereas say the Wicca thing is very precise, very defined. The actual Wicca practice, you got the books are out there. Gardner's own books are the foundation. There are other writers later on, people like Doreen Valente was writing a very similar time frame, was writing about a similar kind of thing, quite closely connected. You had Alexander Sanders was writing his own form of witchcraft that kind of moved a little closer back, funny enough, back to the Golden Dawn ceremonial magic. It's almost like not quite high magic, not quite low magic, it's kind of middle magic. It's close, it's still witchcraft practice, if you like, the idea of it, but it's cloaked less secretly as being more kind of high magic Golden Dawn-esque rituals. There are other groups that existed probably fairly soon after. I mean, a lot of these groups, again, try to claim to have existed about the same time or prior to Gardner's material appearing. But again, there's no real evidence for it. There's a group called the Regency that are based in the UK that are much more secretive, but you can get hold of a couple of books who are written that outline their sort of belief systems, if you like, the structure of their organisations, and they do parallel the Wicca kind of movement. They would say that they were around about the same time or even before then, but they probably only go back to the 60s, whereas Gardner stuff goes back, some of it, to the 40s and 30s even. So, you know, it's a dubious claim there again. You have people like Robert Cochrane, and Roy Bowers, who formed the Tubal Cain kind of more Luciferian witchcraft. So they kind of drawing some of their inspiration even from the Old Testament with the New of Tubal Cain. Again, they claim to have been around for a long time, but later on, Robert Cochrane kind of admitted he pretty much made a lot of his stuff up himself. It was a lot came off the top of his head. He's responsible for an implement that seems to become very much a feature of modern witchcraft, an implement called the stang, which is the two-branched like walking stick or staff that's got like a V shape at the top of it. He claims again it's an ancient witchcraft item. Again, there's no evidence for it before Robert Cochrane's writing. The only vague hint towards it goes right down into the Balkans and some south eastern Europe. There's references to something along those lines down there, but it's kind of vague, and it's unlikely that Robert Cochrane got that information from there. It's only something that's come to light in the wider audience, if you like, more recently with some of the writers of that region. So it's something that, again, appears to become very much part and parcel of modern witchcraft, but yet has no antecedents prior to Robert Cochrane sort of bringing it into his coven and group working. So it's almost like it's become the template which you're the coat rack, if you like, which you hang all sorts of extra bits and bobs onto that might suit your own system of working, which is not a problem. It's only when they start to try and claim this real powerful sort of history behind practice of centuries old, and it all comes back again to the writers of Margaret Murray, this whole idea of this being these hidden secret practices that have been going on for centuries all across Europe, well, there's just no evidence for it. So,
no, but it again, when people try and put a history, an ancient history to something, or when they try and put a secret society on something, it makes you feel different. It makes you feel special. Excuse me. And it gives you that, a level of self-importance where most people nowadays are working very individually, very solitary, and weren't using what's around them. So they're using, like going out and working with the seasons and foraging their own stuff from the landscape around them, whether that be in a city, whether that be in the country, wherever it is. And, taking parts of all of these people and using them in their own way, to the way it works for them, to their own intentions. And actually, those ways are just as good and just as powerful as a full-blown ritualistic, set formatted working.
Absolutely. But it probably brings us really to the main point of what we're talking about here is do your own thing. Don't feel you have to be constrained by what is effectively, I say, become a modern religion. practice your own ideas, forming your own things. I mean, I'm quite happy to admit that the stuff I work with is a mismatch of different stuff, mainly from Europe. I mean, most of it's from Northern Europe. There's connections there. I've written about runes and I have involved in Icelandic magic as well. But, they aren't necessarily the same thing. You draw in different elements to different areas that works with you. Because if you're doing fundamentally, as we were saying back at the beginning, you're manipulating energy. Ultimately, and how that manipulation works. Well, will and intent are the most powerful forms of magic you can have. You have the will and desire to make something work. The magical ritual you might perform might be doing nothing more than focusing your will. But that's enough. That's powerful enough in itself. I mean, I think there's deeper forces at work there as well, which you're kind of tapping into. But again, they're amorphous. They don't have a particular identity. Which is why, as I say, you can, if you're more of the sort of line of the cunning man practice or wise woman practice rather than using the term witch, you are working more intuitively. You are working with what's around and what's available to you, both mentally, emotionally, as well as physical objects as well. You don't have to follow particular belief systems. You can be, and it sounds as bizarre as it might sound, the idea you could be a Christian cunning man. Now, if you ask the average cunning man or wise woman in those days, they would say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's particularly quite strong and evident when you look at North America with the powwow, the Brocari, it's kind of the sort of folk magic of the Pennsylvania Dutch, or Deutsch as it actually is, the Pennsylvanian Germans who came over with their own magical practices that kind of died out in mainland Germany, but continued very much in places like Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, where my co-host, is actually from. And there is a strong element of being very Christian orientated, but at the same time using anti-witchcraft magical practices like the hex signs and spells that they are designed to work with nature and improve the crops, improve the harvest, which is a lot of the magical spells that I was finding in these Victorian memoirs and books were talking about things to sort of help the cow produce more milk, have better crops, and probably the most common one was to find out who you're going to marry. That was the most common kind of spell you could cast, as well as sort of the darker battling against the forces of evil, as was seen at the time, breaking spells, etc., working with the dead and that kind of thing, which is what my book is basically contains, a lot of those kind of rituals and spells and magic. But so you can be a practicing day-to-day magic, if you like, without having to give up or adhere to a particular belief system. Whereas I say things like Wicca, you have the god and the goddess. Now, some would argue that there are elements of nature, and I would agree that's kind of what they're encapsulating. But I do also know Wiccans who would say that they are actual spirits that they're working with, that these are almost like divine energies, which, again, that's what it goes down the road of being a dogmatic religion. And it's unfortunate, I think Wicca is getting more and more like that. It's grown and spread, and it's amazing that it has done, because it is something that it was very clear that Joe Gardner wanted it to be. He didn't want it to be just a cult that he would be the leader of and someone take over from him. There is, as you probably know, there's no organised structure. There's no leaders. There are plenty of people who claim to be the leaders of the Wiccan movement, King of the Witches, etc., etc., but there's no universally recognised structure for that. So, which I think is a good thing, because it does allow it to grow and spread by itself without having some particular bod at the top of the tree telling you what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. But on the other hand, you do have writers who have put down and codified these ideas of belief systems of what you're supposed to adhere to. And, it's unfortunate because it then becomes, as I say, a religion. Witchcraft itself can be the modern traditional witchcraft, it's the last thing we want to really get on to. That tries to tread a middle path. It's not as structured or organised, but there are some very good writers out there in the last sort of 20 years or so, 10, 20 years, who've started writing about proper, what you might call modern traditional witchcraft, which tries to incorporate some of the older written about practices from things like the Victorian folklorists and earlier writers even, trying to bring those in and modernise them and codify them into a system of magic, which is closer to the original material, but is not as rigidly structured as Wicca has become. So it's modern traditional witchcraft. It's a smaller, but it's definitely a growing movement, if you like. It's, again, probably even less structured, because that doesn't necessarily adhere to the idea of forming big covens. You can very much work on your own as a solo practitioner when it comes to modern traditional witchcraft. And you can draw the information yourself from the books I've talked about, the folklorist books, Folklore Society publications. You can find the information. Or there are people like Gemma Gary, a modern writer who's written a book on traditional witchcraft, among many books she's now written. And other writers like Nigel Pearson have written their own material, which is a kind of alternative to Wiccan, and it's not witchcraft in the sort of the broader sense. It's a traditional, but taking traditional ideas from material that's available and from the world around us to fashion a kind of almost like a more personalised way of working. And it talks about the things that have been actually used, not things that someone sat down and wrote down at some point, almost made it off the top of their head, which I'm not necessarily saying Gardner did, but some of those ideas are clearly him codifying bits and pieces, but changing to the point that they're not recognisable as they were in their original form. So that's another movement that's really started to take off in the last 20 years or so, and people are kind of gravitating more towards that traditional side, as well as the growth, of course, of Wicca.
No, I don't disagree with you, but also it gives you reasons why you should be using those things. You know, those tools that, you know, are spoken about for your altar or your focus point. It is the reasons why you should do that. And the relevance in your work of the natural things around you. Like, you know, they talk about the compass, which gives you, you know, your reference points and points of the, you know, seasons and stuff like that. And it gives you reasons why you should use those things, not just because, you know, not just that's what I say.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That's the point of this. It's all well and good using a formatted way of doing something, but you kind of have to know why you're doing that and why that has power and why that has relevance in what you're doing. And you take the bits you want to use in your whatever way you feel comfortable working for your intention or what you're trying to achieve, and know why you're doing that. That's
Absolutely.
the point of it. It's knowing why you're doing that. It doesn't matter really about the history of anything. If it feels right for you and the intention is good and you're working for a specific intention and you know why you're doing it and the power that's behind what you're doing, then go with it.
Absolutely.
Do it.
I mean, that slightly variants what you're saying there is I think the value of using the older material that's genuine, that's been written about, not by someone trying to put together, formulate their own religion, but by, the folklorists who were basically recording what was there, is that you're using something that clearly has a history, that has been used, that, you know, the very fact that someone's remembered the spell long enough for him to write it down, or the writer to have written down what they were told, shows that it's got to have had some kind of history to it. So that gives a little bit more strength, because if enough people are doing something, then it gives it strength and it gives it meaning by itself. And that intention is created as a group mind intention, that I'm doing this, this and this because it has that effect. Because I know hundreds of people over the centuries have actually done this for genuine, not because someone sat down and formulated it in a book, but because someone wrote it down almost as a sideline to what they were actually writing about. As I say, these books are writing about folklore, about the history of regions and the names of places, and, you know, why something's called what it is. And it happens to mention, well, also there's this old lady who said that if you do this and this on that and that, this will happen. You can, if you say these words over this wound, it will heal the wound faster. How do you know? Well, my mum told me that because her mum told her that. You know, they are following that actual history, the genuine history, rather than someone sat down and put pen to paper and made up. Now, again, that can work. You know, if there's enough intention behind it, then something that you invent yourself will work because you're working with that kind of energy. But there is a way in which you can strengthen it by the history that it has genuinely got behind it.
Yeah, I mean, going back to where we started with crystal gridding is, you know, there are two main symbols that they talk about in crystal gridding. I think there's a lot more than that, because the symbols have been used in so many different religions and had a focus of intention at it by hundreds of thousands of people over the years. That gives that symbol that power, regardless of whether or not it's traditional or not. It's given that symbol power. So, yeah, I completely agree with that point.
Well, certainly going back to, again, that you said at the beginning, we mentioned briefly the yantra, which comes from ancient sort of Hindu mysticism. It really is a powerful symbol that is a three-dimensional representation of the expansion of reality, the expansion of the universe. And if you're incorporating that into your designs, and you're doing something that's incredibly powerful because it's been used for thousands of years. So, you know, that is... It comes back to what we were saying before. It works both with this kind of feel with the witchcraft and magic. It works with crystals. It works with the ghost stuff. You're talking about energy manipulation. Fundamentally, as we've said before, we are just energy that's condensed to form matter. But the mass that we have is just a condensation of pure energy. The whole universe is just energy. So if you're working at that most fundamental level, if you've got more than one mind that's working the same thing, either simultaneously, like you were saying with that lead and the sea invention, or through consecutively over centuries, either way, you're still dealing with something that has got oomph behind it because people are doing it, people are following it.
Yeah.
So,
no, I'm completely with you on that. I think it's people underestimate it as well, and I think faith and belief and intention work is incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people need to start. I think a lot of people now are starting to understand that, are starting to work in that way.
Yeah.
And it fascinates me in how many different ways that manifests itself, how many different ways you can work without that rigidity. Rigidity. Thank you again. See, I love it. I love that you pick up my words.
That's the school teacher, I'm afraid.
No, that's absolutely fine. You carry on. Of a formatted religion. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
I find I was talking to a vicar the other day of a Christian faith, and even that, although they follow a specific doctrine, even that is becoming more softer around the edges and is evolving in its own way within a rigid religion.
I think they have to recognise they have got to. It's one of those strangest things that's almost a postmodern thing, that before religion could state its position and you believed it, great. If you didn't, then you go to hell and burn and that kind of damnation. It was about power. And religion, despite what's been happening recently in the West, religion itself is losing its power. Because, we don't want to go down this road at all, but let's not be fooled or mixed up here. People are doing things in the name of a religion. It's not. It's politics. It's war. It's hatred. It's violence. It's using it as a weapon. But it's not religion. Religion itself can be a force for good if it's adaptable and it's more encompassing, but it's also going to be a force of evil if it's directed in a particular way or made to people to feel that outside of that they're bad, or even people within the faith that aren't following it the way they want you to follow it, then you're automatically bad. So it's a force in both directions. My own personal problem has always been the fact that it's too rigid and structured, and it doesn't adapt itself because the world is ever changing. That's the fundamental nature of reality. It is forever changing. And religion can't do that. But in one way, the Wicca movement is more amorphous. It is able to develop better because it hasn't got a central figure leading it. It hasn't got a central tenet as such. You have Gerald. One of the most important things is what the Wiccans call their Book of Shadows, your grimoire of magic. Now, Gerald Gardner wrote several. There's no one particular one that is the one you're supposed to follow. In fact, he never actually wrote a proper one, sat down and said, this is my Book of Shadows, this is what you have to do. He wrote several different attempts at them, and I've got sort of copies of different books. There's a fantastic book called, unfortunate title a little bit, called Inventing Witchcraft, which is a guy whose name I forget who wrote it, who kind of shows how it developed, how it came almost out of the blue and gradually built into something. If say the term invention witchcraft is not meant derogatorily, but it is seen by some as being a very derogative title. But it does go down that road. Well, look, this guy invented his faith. This is how he put it together. This is what he was doing, and it includes examples of his attempts to create this grimoire Book of Shadows and never actually finishing one. Never actually, well, there's been one, but never been fully published, shall we say. So it still has the ability to be more amorphous and more with the nature, if you like, but it's become, unfortunately, over the last sort of 10 years, 15 years or so, become much more rigidly structured, which is why I think traditional witchcraft has grown quite considerably.
But because it has that fluidity to it, you can evolve it in the way you want to.
Exactly.
And you can practice in the way you want to. And that's what makes it very attractive to people nowadays, when there is a disheartening against formatted religion in general.
Yeah.
And that's really where we're at with it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And believe it or not, we're actually almost out of time. So I think we just have a quick roundup of, what are you up to? What's next for Kerry? What's your plans for the future?
Well, I've got lots of radio shows coming up on all sorts of networks. I've got a handcrafted market coming up for Spirit and Soul Island. So I'm busy making stuff at the moment.
So you say obviously you sell your crystals. Where can people get hold of them, Kerry?
I have a website which is www.spiritandSoulIslandCrystals.com, or you can find me on Facebook as Spirit and Soul Island, or I'm on Twitter as well under Spirited Crystal.
Spirited Crystal instead, okay. And Spirit and Soul, did you say?
That's right,
Spirit and as in A-N-D?
It is, yes,
Okay.
spirit and soul. What about yourself?
Well, I've got a couple of things in the pipeline at the moment. First and foremost, finally coming together is a little publishing company that I've been trying to put together for about 4 or 5 years now, but I'm finally going to get the first couple of books out. It's called Mysterium Press, and the idea predominantly is to publish grimoires of magic, proper historic grimoires. Now, they exist, they are available, but at the moment you can either spend a small fortune on leather-bound second-hand editions, or you can buy dreadful sort of printed demands, grotty old little paperback things. There's a kind of gap in the market for like where you get reasonable quality hardbacks, cloth-bound editions for a reasonable price. That's one of the things I'm working on. The first book should be out fairly soon, which I'll be putting some information on my Facebook page about. 2 books. One of them is a paperback, which is a paperback reprint of my own book on runes, which came out with a different publisher last year. The publisher is now doing the hardback again. It's going to be back in stock, but I'm doing a kind of cheap and cheerful paperback edition because people have asked for one, basically. And I thought, well, I'm not going to disappoint. That's not going to be available online. You have to contact me directly if you want to get hold of a copy of that. But the publishing company itself should be up and running fairly soon. The other big thing, which kind of ties into what we've been talking about tonight, is that I am one of the speakers at a conference in the first weekend in September, which is called The Nameless Art. Now, that's an important term because that's basically what traditional witchcraft is often referred to as being the nameless art, not having a particular name. So that's the conference. I am one of the speakers. I'm talking about my book that I've written, the one about the collection of spells and incantations from the folklorists from the Victorian age and up to the 1930s. I have other speakers there, includes Gemma Gary, who mentioned earlier. She's talking about witchcraft practice in, traditional witchcraft, I should say, in Cornwall, where she now lives. We have a chap called Michael Clark, who's a self-confessed cunning man, talking about his interests and his involvement. A chap called Martin Duffy, who's talking about the use of effigies and creating of little, what we call puppets and that sort of thing, which is interesting enough brings on a little link to the next show we're doing, which I'll mention in a moment. We think of voodoo dolls as being the little dolls people stick pins in from voodoo from the Caribbean, and that's absolute nonsense. There's no such thing as a voodoo doll. It's a witchcraft practice. It belongs to Europe and the UK, and Martin will be talking about that at our conference. And we also have my friend Richard Ward, who was the guest last month and will be the guest again next month, who's going to be talking about voodoo. So there's a nice little link in there.
Oh, fantastic.
So
I look forward to coming to that.
Well, hopefully you will do. That's in September. It's the first Saturday. I think it's the second or third, something along those lines, September.
It's the second.
It's the second. Thank you for that. It's the Paranormal Centre in Westcliff, England. Unfortunately, if you're an American audience, you might have a bit of trouble getting to it. But if you put into put into Facebook, The Nameless Art with an E on the end, you'll bring us to our page and you'll see myself and my co-speakers listed there on advertising there. You can get tickets through Eventbrite. There's a link there to Eventbrite, which is the people who are doing the tickets. It's £25 for the day, and that includes the 5 speakers. We also have a number of people selling witchcraft-related items. There's no crystals, I'm afraid, because it's all very much traditional witchcraft material. And as an addition to that, we are also going to visit the site linked to James Murrell, the chap I mentioned earlier on. So he lived in Hadley, which is just down the road from where we're going to be. We're going to where his house used to stand, which unfortunately is not there anymore, but you can visit the site. We're going from there to Hadley Castle, which is a site which has been certainly linked with Cunning Murrell's activities. And perhaps try a bit of meditation there, see if you can contact old James himself. And that's all happening the first week of September on the Saturday night.
Like I say, I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm going to be going. So.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing you there. We have still got some tickets left. It's selling quite well, and as I say, it's going to be an interesting day. And that's really it from us tonight. As I say, my next guest next month, all being as planned, will be my friend Richard Ward again, who's quite the expert on voodoo, and we'll be talking about voodoo and other occult-related issues again. So this show is kind of becoming more of an esoteric show than paranormal, though of course it fits in the paranormal genre, but we tend to be covering more esoteric topics. So you might notice a change of name for this show. May well be coming up. Ron will be back, I can assure you that. I know he's doing his short show, The Goblin Universe, on a weekly basis, but that's because it's quick and simple. It's only about 40 minutes long, as we do over 2 hours. And because we like to really get into depth into topics, we tend to like to have a lot more preparation time. I know Ron really is caught up with his kind of main pursuit, if you like, his main business, his main work, which is speaking at conferences references. So, although he's available for the Goblin universe, it's difficult to fit him into this. But hopefully he'll be back with us a bit later on in the summer. We've got some fantastically interesting guests coming up. As I say, they're all kind of linked around the esoteric. So this show may well get a name change, an image change, to reflect the fact that it's kind of moved in a slightly different direction. But that is it from us for tonight. It just leaves me to say thank you very much, Kay, for being my co-host and interviewee, as it turned out as well, talking about the crystals. It was excellent fun, and hopefully we'll still get together and talk about other things at some point in the future.
Oh, that would be fantastic, and thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. Glad you enjoyed the evening. And that's it from me, and I'll say that's it from Ron. And Ron's here in spirit, if not in body. And thanks very much, guys. See you again. Bye-bye.